All right, good afternoon, everybody. We'd like to start this session, and on behalf of the Kathrada Foundation, let me welcome all of you. My name is Sean Bolton. I work at the foundation. As a few just words of welcome, I've just taken some stuff from Uncle Kathy's own writings. He says, memory reminds us of who we are, gives us a sense of self and steadfastness, and helps us to be free. When we launched the foundation, this was just parts of his speech. He says, for some time before these new developments, that's the coming into being of the foundation, I had been giving considerable thought to the history of the liberation struggle in South Africa and to the role of the minorities. My mind went back to Robben Island days, where ANC prisoners were obliged to go through political classes based on a syllabus. How I wish that our present political and social structures would emulate the Robben Island experience and systematically undertake efforts to combat the widespread ignorance of our history, especially among our youth. On the island, Comrade Walter Sisulu drew up a comprehensive lecture on the history of the ANC. I was asked to prepare the history of the South African Indian Congress. Of special significance was the commitment of the Congress Alliance to the Freedom Charter and to its preamble, which declares for all in our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. This is, of course, was to be the very foundation of the new South Africa. We were greatly heartened in prison when we learned of the launch of the UDF in August 1983. Here were over 15,000 people from 600 organizations representing the entire spectrum of South African society. Africans, whites, coloreds, and Indians. There were Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, workers, peasants, business, professionals, sporting bodies, women, housewives, old and young, who had gathered in Mitchell's Plain to commit themselves to continue the struggle for democracy and non-racialism. It was the most significant gathering in our liberation history since the Congress of the People of 1955, which adopted the Freedom Charter. At great risk and sacrifice, the comrades of the UDF took not only the message, but lit the flames of the struggle and resistance to every nook and corner of the country. He then goes on to say, it was this much acclaimed theme of non-racialism that increasingly cropped up in my mind from time to time as I was increasingly being reminded of it in public and private discussions as well as in the media. And I gradually began to realize that this fundamental cornerstone of our struggle, of the Freedom Charter and of our Constitution, is now slowly receding onto the back burner. And Kathy then goes on to talk about the importance of history and how history, why it's important to capture as widespread the voices and participants of our liberation struggle, so that you give the complete story that this freedom was contributed to by as many South Africans as possible, across all shades, across religion, across class, across geography, and across nationalities. And that's why we are gathered here today, is to start what we call the Living History series. And it's an attempt to bring people here who have stories that we need to record, that we need to share whilst they are alive. I think we've learned with great regret, with somebody like Mosey and others, we didn't do this kind of work. We didn't capture all that we needed to while they were alive. And I would say to a certain extent with Lalu and Kathy as well. Because they were there, we just took it for granted they will always be around. And that's why we're starting this series. And it's hopefully something that at the end today, we would want to ask you, who do you think should be the next person to be on this couch? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Shan, for those introductory comments, and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for coming along. We're going to be interviewing I say Uncle Adbul Minty, but he's now Dr. Adbul Minty. He's just been conferred an honorary doctorate at Wits University a few weeks ago, so he is now formally a doctor. Congratulations for that. And we want to make this as in a kind of conversational style, very easygoing, very relaxed, also quite personal. So we want to know the man. Many activists have heard of Adbul Minty, but I don't think many activists had had an opportunity actually interacting with him, conversing with him, talking about his life. I think Kathy and Chiba and others, because they lived very close to us and we were, we saw them earlier on. We built a relationship with them. But with Uncle Adbul, he came back in 1992, I think. And then he got involved in foreign affairs. And in the nature of that work, I mean, he traveled quite extensively. He's more out of the country doing broader work for the government. And then he became an ambassador. So activists who, for the years that they were in exile, yes, the people who were in London, etc., would have worked with him and know him. But many of the activists locally don't know the person. They can't feel him. And we thought it would be a wonderful gesture on our part to start with this series with someone like Adbul Minty. Now, Adbul Minty has had I can't call it a career. I mean, he is a leading anti-apartheid activist. So he left the country in 1958 to study. But before that, he was an activist as a youngster in the Transvaal Indian Youth Congress. And he attended what was called then the Congress School. So we will talk a little bit about this Congress School that was based in Portsmouth. And then at an amazing age, at the age of 22, he was appointed or elected or nominated as the Honorary Secretary of the British Anti-Apartheid Movement. Now today when we talk to some of the younger activists and say they must take leadership positions, they say we're still young. I was quite amazed at that age, the age of 22, and he'll tell us how he got to that point. But he remained as the Honorary Secretary until 1994, for 32 years. It's an unbroken sort of chain of involvement in building the solidarity movement, the anti-apartheid movement in the UK. And of course, through that, his interactions with other solidarity movements in other parts of the world. So we will explore some part of that. And then Adbul Minty is very, I think in the diplomatic circles, he's known for his work in the field of nuclear disarmament. And South Africa took the historic decision earlier on in the negotiations to disarm its nuclear capabilities. And we'd like to get some insight into that. That was done under secrecy within close circles at Podesa. And I don't think that we've really had a chance to talk about it more openly, so we'll get some insight into that. Well, then he became a public servant. He was Deputy Director General in the Department of Foreign Affairs then, but DEVCO now. Played a very important role in the transition period and the new foreign policy outlook of this country. And of course, it's a very topical area of discourse, public discourse today. So maybe you'll be at liberty to share some insights, maybe even about the current situation. We'll see how the discussion goes. And then he became ambassador. So he was based in Geneva. That's where I first really met him. I was on a trip abroad and we managed to get together for a cup of coffee. And that was the first time I could feel Adbul Minty, just to converse with him and talk to him at leisure. So we'll get a bit of insight into that. And now he's a retired man. But before we get into all this political stuff, Adbul Minty is married to Khatija. She comes from Van der Bijlpark. And maybe you should just start off. How did you find this young Afrikaner girl from Van der Bijlpark? You got married to her.
Well, I wasn't looking for an Afrikaner girl as such, but we met at a swimming place. Because I couldn't swim, I wanted to learn to swim, and she was a swimmer, so that's how we met. And then we married after that. And the house that I still have now was the one I had then, because when I returned to South Africa, we had to be near Pretoria for practical purposes. And so I went for a house in Monument Park, which was close to the airport, the main airport as well as the military airport, and also was possible to get to Pretoria flight. So then we lived there after that.
So can I be a bit naughty? Was your first kiss in the swimming pool? Oh, so let's go back to your early life. I mean, you were born and bred in Fordsburg. Or, no, you were in one of the country towns, yes. I know that. And then for the better part of your youth, you were in Fordsburg. And you were brought up more by your grandfather, the Garde family. So a little bit about the early life in Fordsburg, and then you can move on to the Congress School. How did you get to the Congress School?
Okay.
And what was the Congress School, the history of that?
Well, I grew up with my grandparents in Ferreirastown near Market Street, just a little distance from Fordsburg. And just opposite was the Indian fruit market. And that's where I grew up. Fortunately, just around the corner from there was the ANC office, where there was a chemist on the corner, and next to it was the ANC office. So I used to go there regularly. And then when I went to the so-called Congress School, which proper name it was known as the Central Indian High School, which was set up because the government were moving a whole lot of young Indians to Lenasia. And they thought that if they took the younger ones there, then the parents would also insist on moving, particularly the mothers, so they could be closer to the children and not be so far away. But this was a protest school that Uncle Kathy and others got together to organize. So when that school was organized, many of us decided to attend that school. It's the first school in the country which had non-racial staff, or staff of all races. And for pupils were all Indians because they were from the Indian school, moved to this one. And that school was a great learning process for many of us. It produced many even national leaders, like the Bahad brothers who were also at that school, and many others. So it was a historic school. And it was our first experiment. I was made the school secretary by the principal, Ikamo. And we were responsible for our own discipline. It was the only school in the whole country. The pupils were responsible for their own discipline and organization. So we attended the school. The school was raided often because many of our teachers were members of the Congress Alliance. And so police came to raid them and to possibly arrest them. We don't know. But they came there to take them away to their homes for their homes to be searched. And sometimes when they came, when we were just pupils outside, we refused to go home. They said we should go home, but we stayed outside the school premises. And as they tried to take our teachers away, we tried to obstruct that process as far as possible. In one incident, one of our fellow pupils, a young girl, she just took the key out of the Ford flying squad car that they used to use with radios and that. And when she saw the police come down, she threw it on a horse and cart that was having fruit at the bottom. So the police couldn't recover the keys. And then they called others on the radio what to do, bring another car, and can't join any wires and so on. So we called all the children and said, come, they're teaching us how to steal cars. We can learn how to connect the wires. So it was a very interesting school because the pupils were as committed as the teachers and others for maintaining it.
The staff members, if you can share some names with us?
Well, yes, of course, Ram Fisher's wife, Molly Fisher. She taught us Afrikaans, and she was a great teacher. She, in the end, lost her life going to prison. Okay, and had a car accident. Then there's Mick Hamel, who was the first headmaster. He was succeeded by Musaji, who was the headmaster. The most popular teacher was probably Alfred Hutchinson, who taught us English. And when he was arrested for the treason trial at that time, we were told that we had to come on Monday and there would be another teacher and so on. And the whole school, in the class at least I was in, we refused. We don't want to go anywhere. We want him to finish the story of White Land, which he was reading to us. So we insisted on going to school, so we had to go to school earlier. so that they could go for the treason trial later. And so they shouldn't be late, and we wanted our education. So we went to school early to get Alfred Hutchinson to be our teacher at that time. So there was a lot of solidarity between the teachers and us. I was also lucky that around the corner from where I lived was the ANC office. So many of the teachers were working in the Congress Alliance, and they would walk to West Street, the ANC office. So I would walk with them from Portsmouth to West Street, and we would go there. And there would be Babla Saluji, many others who would be working in the Congress office. And we interacted with them, did posters and all the rest of it in there. And my home was just across the street, my grandparents lived. So we developed a community, and that was about 2 blocks away from where Uncle Kathy lived at that time. So we were in a political environment throughout that time.
And then which year did you matriculate?
I didn't matriculate in South Africa because my school was interrupted. And I went abroad and did O-levels and A-levels, which was a pre-university qualification for 2 years. So that I did abroad, I didn't do that.
So you left in 1958?
I left in 1958.
And then completed in London?
In London.
All right. And then just quickly, your studies in London, what did you do?
Well, when I first went to London, I went to one of the colleges to do my so-called O-levels. And you needed O-level and A-level subjects to get into university. So I got the O-levels there, and then I moved to Regent Street Polytechnic, which is right in the middle, right next to Oxford Street in London. And I went to do my A-levels there. And then there next to us was a music show. So I met Paul Robeson, because he and others used to come there to buy their music. And he said, "Oh, do you know Dr. Dadu?" I said, "Yes." He said, "From South Africa." "You know Dr. Dadu?" "Yeah, well, that's good. Must greet him." So there was that kind of instant friendship with very well-known people who just happened to be in the street. Yeah. So that was part of our activity. But as soon as I got to London, I wanted to see Canon Collins, because he was running the Defence and Aid Fund, and which defended the treason trials in South Africa at the time. And Trevor Huddleston, whom I had met in South Africa at our school, he came to give us prizes, and he was sent back to England by the church. When he was in London, I phoned him, went to see him, and he gave me a note to Canon Collins, and a week later I saw Canon Collins. And Trevor Huddleston really became my main contact. And then later, of course, he became president of the anti-apartheid movement and so on. So for many years, I worked with him. And then Canon Collins was very instrumental in saving the lives of the first treason trials. People don't know this at this time because they don't recognize the fact he raised at that time £10,000, which was a lot of money at that time, and got lawyers and legal people to defend Nelson Mandela and other political leaders in South Africa. So I wanted to work with Canon Collins, and I went, introduced myself, and he helped me. He had an organization called Christian Action. So I said, "But I would like to join it because they did many booklets on Southern Africa." And I said, "I'd like to support you and work with you, but I'm not a Christian." So Canon Collins, near his fireplace, sat down and says, "But tell me, do you believe that Christ was a good man?" I said, "Yes." He says, "You can join." So I joined Christian Action like that and worked with him right until his death many decades later. So he was a very strong supporter of people in South Africa, anybody who was in political concerns or others. Then, of course, the people who came to London were Bishop Reeves. He was a bishop in Johannesburg. He was running the Defence and Aid Fund here in South Africa, so Canon Collins used to send money to him. And after Sharpeville, Bishop Reeves came abroad to tell the world what had happened at Sharpeville. And then the South African government stopped him from returning to South Africa. So he was stuck in London. He had a great deal of difficulty in finding the church. People in the church were not too sympathetic to him. He supported our campaign for investments to be withdrawn from South Africa. People shouldn't have it. They thought that was too political, so they didn't support him. So I got to know these people quite well by interacting with them regularly. And he, although I have to do something about it, he left me all his books and so on in his will, so that I must look after it afterwards.
So how is it that you got elected or appointed onto the British anti-apartheid movement?
Well,
And became the honorary secretary at such a young age.
Well, some of us, as soon as I arrived in London, within a few weeks, a few of us met and decided to have a demonstration, a protest demonstration. We still have a photograph somewhere. And that was before the boycott movement or the anti-apartheid movement formed. So we took part in that. We were about 20 South Africans, or about that, in Hyde Park. And then we formed the boycott movement. The idea was that we would have a 1-month intensive period of boycott in March 1960. And then we would concentrate on boycott of South Africa. When the boycott movement was formed, I was a membership secretary, and the boycott movement worked very actively throughout the country, and the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, the trade union movement, and the churches supported us. So we had a base in the country as we went along. We also had a conservative, Lord Altrincham, who was also a member. So we called ourselves an all-party organisation. But we tried to extend it to anybody who wanted to join. Later, after Sharpeville, Barbara Castle, who had been very active at the Commonwealth Conference at the time, which took place in London, and she organised a lobby there of prominent actors and actresses and so on to come to demand that South Africa should be excluded from the Commonwealth. There's no provision in the Commonwealth to exclude a member or expel a member, but we still felt this shouldn't be a member of the Commonwealth. So, first time, the next Commonwealth Conference, the South African Prime Minister attended. Before that, the Foreign Minister, I think, called Lowe, used to attend. And when he attended there, he then decided to withdraw the application because he said nobody must discuss apartheid in the Commonwealth. And the Indian government and others said, no, we insist on discussing it. So he decided not to reapply for membership because when South Africa became a republic, it had to reapply to become a membership of the Commonwealth. It was a dominion before. So South Africa left the Commonwealth and Barbara Castle became very much more active. She had visited South Africa previously and she was very prominent and she insisted that weekend of the end of March that we must change our name from the boycott movement to the anti-apartheid movement because she said we must work permanently to destroy apartheid. We can't just be boycotting South African goods. So I worked with her quite a lot at that time. And then later, later US President Oliver Tambo came to see me and said that I must become the secretary of the anti-apartheid movement. I told him, I can't do that, I'm studying, I have other things to do. And he said, no, you have to, because if you don't, then Barbara Castle won't agree to be president of the anti-apartheid movement. We need her as a president. So that's how I became the honorary secretary. I was elected at the annual meeting and so on. I became honorary secretary of the anti-apartheid movement, and she was the president of the anti-apartheid. So we worked together quite a lot together.
In those early years, obviously the anti-apartheid movement became quite strong in the late 80s, I would say, yeah, 70s and 80s. But in the late 60s, early 70s, just talk us through your work, your activities, the struggles that you had.
Well, very many people don't know that from the time we started, we said we would work on southern Africa. So we had to monitor Zimbabwe very closely for a long time because with UDI in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean government and the British government were trying to arrange what we called a sellout. That is not to give Africans the rights and to give the independence to Zimbabwe. So we tried to work for no NIBMA, no independence before African majority rule, was a slogan we used. And we campaigned a lot more in Zimbabwe than on other issues at the time, even more than South Africa at times, because there was a real danger of abdication to the illegal regime in Zimbabwe. So we worked on Zimbabwe, we then worked on Angola, Mozambique, and so we worked with the frontline states as they became later. And so people don't realize that the anti-apartheid movement didn't just work on South Africa, but worked on, for liberation in Southern Africa. Because we saw an unholy alliance between Rhodesia, South Africa, and the former Portuguese colonies. And they together supported each other to resist African advance in the region. So we felt we had to support the African struggle, so we had to look at it in a united way. We didn't very actively work in a united way on Botswana and Lesotho because they were not part of the frontline states later, and they were not as committed because they were being made targets by the apartheid regime.
And some of the more memorable campaigns that you guys organized that period?
Well, we organized exclusion from the Commonwealth. We organized mainly political prisoners campaigns, because we began with the agreement of the Congress movement and the ANC in particular that we could run a campaign on Mandela. Up to then, the ANC was reluctant that we should run campaigns on particular individuals. We should run general campaigns. We felt we needed to have people so that people abroad could identify with those people and know about them. So then that was agreed. We ran very big campaigns. Perhaps the biggest campaigns that any organization ran on any issue was the worldwide Mandela campaign. I think there were 146 buildings in London, in Britain, named after him, and all over the world it spread very strongly. So we ran a lot of campaigns on political prisoners because we didn't want them to be forgotten, and when they were on trial, for them not to be executed. But of course, some people were executed who were sentenced to death, and then we had a lot of protests. But we worked as much in Zimbabwe and the other regional countries together in Southern Africa and so on. And many other organizations abroad also began to get support from us, and they also began to run their own campaigns. So although we were a British organization, we had very close links with others. Also, I was asked, and I lobbied all the Commonwealth conferences from them, because after that 1973 was the first conference outside of Britain that was in Singapore. And we got thousands of people to sign a petition about no arms to South Africa. I was asked to take it to Singapore, and all the bishops in Britain signed it. There was a great deal of support for the campaign, but the British Prime Minister wanted to sell helicopters to South Africa, so we had to try and stop those arms sales as well. So we went to the Commonwealth in Singapore, and there were strange things that happened. The Singapore government apparently said somewhere that they would arrest me if I arrived there and protested and so on. I didn't know much about it, but the Nigerians told me later that the Nigerians had told them if I was not allowed, they wouldn't attend the conference. I don't know if it was true, but anyway, nobody arrested me when I came. Although when I went at the airport, 2 or 3 security people followed me right through from the time I got off the aircraft. But before I left, small little incidents. When we had to go from our office to the airport, I was given 2 big suitcases of petitions. And the taxi fare was expensive, and nobody took taxis to go to the airport here. But I had to because I had these suitcases. When we got to the Heathrow airport, the taxi driver said, no, he would give me free ride. I don't have to pay. So this was quite remarkable because on our big bags we had no arms for apartheid, slogans on top of the bag so you could read from there. When I went to check in at the Pan American desk there too, I had a lot of weight because I had all these petitions. Again, the lady said, you don't have to pay the excess. You waive that off. So this was a new experience for us, that we were actually favored in a way by people who felt that we shouldn't supply arms to South Africa. So I waited around, and then the Commonwealth Secretary General, a Canadian gentleman at that time, Arnold Smith, he told me that if the Singapore government did not meet me, he would meet me and receive the petitions. But 2 days before the conference ended, 2 or 3 days before, they informed me that they would like to see me. The foreign minister would. So it was strange because up to now they didn't want to. What happened was, at the conference, there was a lot of debate about Soviet threats in the Indian Ocean and naval threat. And they felt that Britain needed these helicopters to sell to South Africa under the Simonstown Agreement so that South Africa would also patrol the area and assist in the general anti-communist campaigns. So we were surprised at this development, but this was a case where for Heath, the Prime Minister, British Prime Minister, not to supply arms to South Africa. And the rest of the Commonwealth was against it. They didn't want it to be done. But then in the middle of this conference, Lee Kuan Yew apparently, according to some commentators, hosted the conference so he could become Secretary General of the UN. It was a launching pad. When he saw that Africans, particularly President Kaunda, and he said many Singapore people had died there in the war. Kaunda said, well, I also lost our nationals before you were in the camp. And they also died. And so that campaign developed, and then he realized that he had no prospect of getting any support for the Commonwealth job if this didn't succeed. So I think I was allowed to go there and be received as a guest because we would get support from the African and Asian countries. So at that time we managed to get South Africa out. In the end, South Africa, of course, was not supplied with those helicopters, although some Mr. Heath did supply. But when we got back abroad, there was a lot of support overseas for our cause. So that was the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth conference after that, I went to every conference right up to freedom of South Africa, except two. One because we didn't have money, and the other one because I was ill. But the other ways I was able to attend. So countries like Tanzania and Zambia and so on said they would pay for me and I could be part of their delegation. But at a very early stage we said, no, we cannot be attached to any government. We have to work with everybody. So we will raise our own funds and go do it if we can manage, but not be committed to any particular government. Now this was very wise because later, when some of the countries recognized Biafra, Tanzania recognized Biafra and Zambia did, so if we had gone with them, we would have got opposition from Nigeria. But as it happened, we worked with all of them, and I helped to draft many of the speeches of the African leaders, including the Nigerians. But the important thing is that at that time, no African or Asian country had representatives in South Africa because of the boycott. So they didn't know what was going on firsthand. So they relied on the anti-apartheid movement and us. And what we said to them was happening in Southern Africa. They believed it and they acted on it. So we developed a lot of solidarity with the African countries, the Afro-Asian countries, and the Caribbean countries became very active as well. So that was the experience at the early time.
How many people worked in the anti-apartheid office?
Well, at the beginning, we had one person. And then later we had financial problems, so that person agreed to work half-time. But there were many volunteers who would come after, schools were closed or universities were closed and help in the evening and afternoon. But very few at the beginning, there weren't very many. But it became in the 80s the world's biggest solidarity movement of its kind on any subject. And that's important to recall because in Britain we had a very powerful movement, the campaign for nuclear disarmament, with Bertrand Russell, Canon Collins was chairman of it, and so on. So they became very big, but we became even bigger than them later. And everybody recognized it as a principal NGO in the world on all these different subjects.
When did you people discover that South Africa was developing a nuclear capability, about that South Africa that is? Yeah. And what did you do about it? How did you mobilize against that?
Well, I was doing research. I had done my master's degree and then I was registered for a PhD. And as I was doing research, I found that South Africa was planning nuclear and other intentions. So I decided to give up my PhD. Sponsors were very unhappy because they thought it did degree, but I thought that if I did degree, the degree would be published. So the facts that I would do research would be known. And therefore we wanted to stop it. So I stopped the degree. But the Richardson Institute for Conflict and Peace Research in Britain also kept me as a research fellow at the same time as the anti-apartheid work I did. And so I did more research on it. And in 1977-79, we found that one South African minister had even said that they must not only look at the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So if you don't look at only the peaceful uses, you look at others. But I had always suspected the two nuclear power plants that we still have now, that they were set up and other nuclear things were done to create experts. And so as you developed expertise in nuclear technology, you could also go to the nuclear weapons side. And South Africa, of course, at that time, we monitored it very closely, cooperated a great deal with Israel. And Israel was developing its own nuclear weapons. So the two had a lot of things in solidarity because together, because they had the whole world against them over these subjects, and yet they were trying to develop those. So at that time we suspected it, and then when this little booklet I wrote in 1969, South Africa's Defense Strategy, which anti-apartheid published, I think there are 16 editions of it, in several languages. That for the first time exposed South Africa's defense strategy and its whole aggressive policy, what it did and how it brought particular weapons to use for particular purposes. All that we analyzed and talked about. And the important thing is, although it was very difficult and we relied entirely on voluntary things, never they find a single thing we had done that was wrong. There was not a single fact that anybody disputed. Now that's quite a record for an NGO for 50 years almost. So that is how we started the work on the nuclear things. And then South Africa announced later that it was giving up nuclear weapons. It had 6 nuclear weapons and it destroyed itself and so on. And my first reaction was that that's not true. The information we had researched showed that it would have more than 6 nuclear weapons, but it may have given it to Israel or somebody. We don't know. So that whole area has not been looked at, and nobody really knows, well, unless the people who did it, the precise number of nuclear weapons.
There's a lot of solidarity work taking place in South Africa. It's Palestinian or Sahrawi Republic or Swaziland, etc. But my sense is that it's not really becoming a mass popular movement of support for any cause. It's small groups of activists, perhaps a few loyalists, a few people linked to political parties, etc. How did you guys build a mass popular movement in the UK, anti-apartheid movement? And what were the tactics that you used, the methods? Because I think that's going to be lost. And my sense is that in South Africa, even the solidarity movements tend to be too narrow in their approach. And they're unable to break new ground and bring in other forces in support of a broader cause or broader agenda.
I think the first lesson is that we had simple campaigns, and they were straightforward. We started off with a boycott campaign. Why boycott South African goods? As Julius Nyerere at the time had said, they were not asking the British people to do anything special. All they were doing is saying, don't give financial support to the apartheid regime. So withdraw your support through South African fruit. That was a simple message. And I went to Birmingham once, I think 1960, and met a 7-year-old girl. And her parents imposing the boycott, and they liked oranges. But she had to do without oranges. So I had a long talk with her about it. But we tried to explain to people why we were doing it, relating it to the situation. Not that we were anti-white or anything else. And we had, of course, supporters from all sections. That is important. We were never close to the Conservative Party, for example, although the Conservative Party did not like the anti-apartheid movement and campaigned against it, particularly later with Mrs. Thatcher and so on. But at that time, but we still had Lord Altrincham, a Conservative MP, Lord, who was a member of the anti-apartheid movement and worked. So we had an open thing for everybody to join us on a common program. Now you need a common program in order to unite people for the purpose. But if you have very complicated political structures, then you splinter the groups and divide them and they move in different ways. Also, we were not so concerned about raising a lot of money. What we said was that as we are active, if we do good work, people will give us money when they see our protests and our activities. If we don't do good work, they won't give us money. Because for people who don't have much money, and they're not the rich people to whom we went to, they would have to be committed that we are doing valuable work. And that allowed us to always be legitimate. We couldn't work on fancy ideas or clever politics or whatever if we didn't create a base among the ordinary people. And that is, I think, the one success of the anti-apartheid movement. But we also had difficulties. We didn't have money at times, we were going down and so on. As I say, people worked half-time and elsewhere. But we kept our integrity. And having kept the integrity of a difficult period and good period, then support came. And we then became, as I said before, the biggest movement in Britain and in the world, they said. But it was because of this integrity that we had throughout. And we worked on that integrity. And we were never wrong. So we made sure we checked everything. There were various attempts, particularly in the military field, by the South African government to feed us with false information. I even got information with the letterheads appearing to be from American arms companies. And the letter said to somebody in South Africa, we will sell you XYZ. They thought we would use this as to campaign against those items. But we always double-checked. We always thought of the strategy of the apartheid regime. What was it planning to do? What was important for the apartheid regime? And if it didn't fit into that, we didn't accept it. We needed final evidence. The other advantage we had in Britain in the late 60s and 70s was that people working in the arms companies themselves were strong supporters of the anti-apartheid movement, and they fed us with information. And so the apartheid regime didn't know how we got this information, but we got it through various ways. That was just one of the ways, various ways. So there are people working in the arms companies themselves who had trust in us that we wouldn't betray them, we wouldn't reveal their names, they wouldn't lose their jobs if they told us. And they gave us information. And that allowed us to run our campaigns.
Is your family life there in Britain, London? Girlfriends?
No, I was married for a short while, 2 years. And then later I moved to Norway. I was also living what they call sambor. It's a Norwegian term for a social marriage with the wife who was Norwegian. And so I was aboard there. But beyond that, we couldn't think of anything beyond that because the political campaigns became the important things that we had to do from time to time.
And your links with your family at home in South Africa?
Yes, as much as I could, I kept them. And one of my sisters who passed away, she made a point with her husband to come and visit me almost every year. And that was the one link I had. There were times when I would be in London driving my little van, and I would see somebody on the corner of Oxford Street and see this my cousin from South Africa. What's he doing here? So I parked around the corner and see him, and he said, "Oh, we were going to come and see you just before we left. When are you leaving?" "We're leaving in 2 days." I said, "Well, you don't have much time." But they were all afraid that the South African agents or people who supported them may see them and may ask them. And some people I met abroad did get in trouble if they came to South Africa, so I had to be very careful. Once I went to Mecca to see my father, whom I hadn't met for a long time. I went to an OU conference when I first went there. And there too, you had to get a small room on the side and not tell people I was there. But a lot of people queued up to see me. So they saw me one after the other. No two people would see me together because they were afraid the other one would tell the police when they came back. So those kind of security concerns which would involve some risk, but people did that. So they were quite remarkable experiences for us.
Just your relationship with SANROC, South African National Olympic
Committee.
Unracial Olympic Committee,
Yes.
SANROC.
Yes, I was involved with it slightly in South Africa because I liked sport. And then when Dennis Brutus had been to Mozambique and he was shot escaping, so they returned him to South Africa. And he couldn't travel abroad, so they asked that I should go to the Baden-Baden Olympic Conference in 1961. And I went to that conference. And the head of the Olympics, Mr. Brundage, was a great supporter of apartheid South Africa, didn't want to have anything to do with us. I stayed in the hotel at night from 7 o'clock in the passage until 4:30 in the morning. I went down 5:30, 6:30, I knocked at his door. And he opened it thinking I was a messenger. Because an Indian in Germany in a hotel, there must be a worker in the place. So he opened the door, "Oh, what is it you want? Why are you disturbing me?" I said, "There's a letter from Dennis Brutus." Gave it to him and left. So he had the first request to exclude South Africa. And then, there were new African countries that had to become independent. So I worked with them, and they made a statement at that Baden-Baden that if by the time they are independent, some were not independent, they would not apply to the Olympic movement if South Africa was still a member. So that was a very strong pressure, straight away. But there were funny things going on. At that time, the South African official representatives who came there was a question. They wouldn't allow joint Africans and non-Africans running together. I should say whites and non-whites. They shouldn't run together. So they said, "How will you select the best person?" "Oh, we will look at the time. And what happens if the time is the same?" oh, we have a lot of experience in the mines in South Africa. We'll measure their biceps. And the one who has the widest biceps will be the one we'll choose. Of course, they didn't choose any black people at the time. So this made the whole world realize that this was like Nazi Germany. They were exposing themselves without knowing what they were saying because they were so convinced about their own system being right. So South Africa, at least after that, was suspended, and in the next Olympic meeting, it was excluded from the International Olympics. But that was a very big success for us because it was the first international body to remove South Africa.
What year was this?
63, it was finally expelled. 62, it was suspended. So we were active on the sports field and everything else. There were people in the British anti-apartheid movement when we said we want to stop the rugby tours and the cricket tours and so on, that at that time we were active on. There were people on our committee who said, no, you don't want to do a sport when you've got sanctions to do, We said, no, we had to do it. And that was one of the values of it. That hit white South Africa harder than anything else was a sports boycott.
Now, when you came back, and what was the transition like? How did you didn't come in 1990 as soon as the ANC was unbanned?
No, you see, Trevor Huddleston and I were the only two people banned by the South African government from being allowed to come in. So my father was very ill, and people thought he was dying, and he was. So we asked for special permission for me to come. And David Steele was a leader of the Liberal Party in England. He wrote to the South African ambassador and said they must have special permission to go and see my father. There was a lot of negotiations between them, and then in the end they said that I could. But even when I was about to leave, I came to London from Norway, they put a whole lot of conditions. And I said, I'm not accepting any conditions. I'm going to South Africa, and I'll do, you can't say anything, and so on. I said, no, I'm still Secretary of the Anti-Apartheid Movement. I'll say whatever I want, and I'm going. So they went through a lot of problems. I went to the South African Embassy in Norway for my visa permission to go. My British passport, because I needed a visa. But normally you don't need a visa if you have a British passport. But because we were banned already, Trevor Huddleston and I, we tried to get this permission from them to go. I went to the embassy, the ambassador welcomed me in, an Afrikaner gentleman, great fun and so on, very friendly. He knows what's going on in South Africa, it's all changing and I'll find everything changed. So anyway, I listened to him. But when his secretary came and brought us tea, she couldn't give me the tea first. She passed me, took both cups there, and the ambassador had to give me the cup. So the racial factor was still there. I was still an enemy and couldn't be given a cup of tea. So we had that experience. Then he said, please wait in this room because they'll be ready, they'll stamp in a minute. I waited there, I think for about an hour longer. And then I went, I said, what's happening to my visa? If you're not giving it to me, I'm going home. No, please wait. Then he says, no, they're worried that you'll go make statements there and you shouldn't, and I'll advise you not to. And if you can give that assurance to South Africans, they'll authorize it. I said, no, I can't give any assurance to anybody. I'm still going there quite legally, and I'm Secretary of the British Anti-Apartheid Movement, so if I have to say something, I'll say it, and the World Campaign. So they then issued me the visa. When I went on the plane, and it came, and two people from Sweden were on the same flight who knew me. So they wouldn't let me go past the immigration people alone. They escorted me to 12. So when we got into Johannesburg, the airport, and I gave my passport, the official there didn't look at the fact that I was banned. So I said, you better look, I'm not allowed to enter. This is a special permission I have. So this is a document I have. So then they looked, and they allowed me through. But I was staying in a hotel. I came, I went to see my father and other relatives and so on. And people, this is really a traumatic experience. Because when I came in, there were people I hadn't seen for about 30 years. And some were like in my nightmare, I was not aware it was happening. And when I went to a clock shop, my father's home, stayed there, I didn't sleep that much, having all kinds of images of people I had met after such a long time, and how I'd left them in that sort of. And then, of course, I arranged also, with the help of the Norwegian government authorities, to go to the graveyards. My grandmother, and my grandfather, and so on. So when I went through there, in the graveyard, you just see a whole lot of names, people whom I knew when they were all dead, all buried, just one after the other. So that was quite, it took a few days to just absorb that and to recover from that in human terms. But I was staying at a hotel not far from here for a time when I was to see members of the liberation movement and so on, left to come to Johannesburg for that. And two security guys staying in the rooms next to me. And even if I came late to them, because I went to meetings often and went late to the hotel, as I went up to the reception, they would follow me as if they were with me until I got the key. And when I went upstairs, they would follow me. And they happened to have rooms next to me. Two people. I had a middle room, they had two rooms. So I went in there, and I thought of various things, put a chair by the door or something, they'll walk in. Then I thought, no, if they want to kill me, they'll kill me. It's a country, they'll do what they want. I can't worry about it. So it just got out of my mind. And I was there for about 3-4 days for a conference over that. So there were very strange experiences, but also as I saw family members, some of whom I saw abroad when they came abroad. And here, I mean, there's a couple that I was very close to, my aunt and uncle, and one of the members had passed away. But when I saw the other one alone, I'd never seen them separate in my life. So that was very traumatic. So I'm looking now, where's the other person? Although I'd heard that that person had passed away. So there were strange experiences. And the South Africans said the government, I mustn't give any interviews, but when I went, I did some radio interviews and so on.
You've rubbed shoulders with many world leaders through the Commonwealth and in different parts of the world, etc. Which leader made the greatest impact on you or left the greatest impression?
Well, obviously, Trevor Hudson had a big impact on me because I met him and when he was in the anti-apartheid movement. Julius Nyerere met him there. And then he was appointed bishop in Tanzania. So he left. But then he came back after he retired. Then he was made, the person responsible for the Anglican Church for the Indian Ocean area, so 7 from Mauritius and so on. Then he came back in the 80s, and he decided that before he continued this as president of the anti-apartheid movement, which is what we wanted him to do, others had been president before, he said no, he had to go to the frontline states and consult Africa. He can't do this work for Africa without Africans. So he asked me to join him, which I did. So we visited the frontline states for about 3 weeks. And after that, he came back and became active as the president of the anti-apartheid. So he gave the anti-apartheid movement a lot of dignity and position because of what he did and because of what he stood for. So Trevor Huddleston was really remarkable. I was a bit surprised that when we had a British state visit to Britain, no one mentioned Trevor Huddleston or Bishop Reeves. They were British people, had come to South Africa as priests, had led the struggle here. Close confidants of President Mandela and others, people have forgotten them. So it's important to remember who were part, people who are part of our history, because you lose yourself if you lose your history. So he was not lost. Then the other person of remarkable ability, globally speaking, is Julius Nyerere. He was leader of the opposition when he joined the anti-apartheid movement in our struggles in 59-60. Then he became Prime Minister. Anyway, when he became leader of Tanganyika, as it was, they didn't even have a military. but they decided to take a strong stand on the Portuguese colony of Mozambique, which was a neighbor. And because he did that, they were attacked militarily. Portugal was a member of NATO and had all the arms that it wanted. Attack them. So Nyerere had to build up his own army for the first time. Never had an army. They built it up, they defended themselves, they attacked Portugal, and then when Portugal collapsed later, and then the colonies became independent, then of course he was able to work more actively. But to imagine that people in the whole countries were under threat, and if only they surrendered, they wouldn't be suffered, and they refused to surrender. And they supported the independent cause. So I think the frontline countries have suffered more than many people in South Africa have suffered because of the fight against apartheid. This also is not fashionable to talk about a great deal or to write about, but it's very important history, because without their sacrifice and without their commitment, we wouldn't be where we were later. We didn't have to suffer as much in South Africa as they had to, because they were bombed, they were killed, their military was destroyed, their countries were destroyed, their railroads were destroyed, their roads were destroyed in their campaign to support the liberation struggle in South Africa. And that's why many of us support the frontline states, although people say, no, you mustn't have foreigners here. Foreigners are Africans. How can a foreign African be foreigner? But our foreigners are considered to be Africans, and you mustn't have them. They forget what sacrifices those people made in their history for the struggle here. So Julius Nyerere was a very, very impressive leader.
Just if we come now to the period of transition, I mean, what was the thinking in the liberation movement around the issue of nuclear disarmament, and why? I know you played a very big role in getting South Africa to the position that it has taken ultimately. What was your thinking, and what is the government and the liberation movement's thinking?
Yeah, well, you see, when we were children, we heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and how the Americans had bombed Japan. And I visited Hiroshima twice and Nagasaki once and saw the victims of the radiation at the time. So they were still alive at the time. So that generation of people that I grew up with when I was at school, they had a very big impact because of the attack on Japan. And therefore people were very much against nuclear weapons because this was not a necessary weapon to use. So indiscriminate, killed everybody, killed them alive. And therefore, that was part of the background. It was a generational thing as well. So I was always saying South Africa should not have nuclear weapons, because what do you want to do with a nuclear weapon? What do people do with nuclear weapons, except to threaten others? They can't use it, because the minute they use it, somebody will use it against them if they are deterred. So what would be the use of nuclear weapons? So we were against nuclear weapons as such, and I was certainly completely against it. So throughout in South Africa and Africa, we worked for African nuclear weapon-free zone. I worked for that. Afterwards, the government gave me an opportunity, South African government, to unite the continent, and then later in the 90s, the African continent declared itself a nuclear weapon-free zone. And then globally too, we worked for nuclear disarmament in the international conferences on disarmament and so on. And South Africa played a very leading role in that, and give you as an example of what would. And we didn't want nuclear weapons, so we were against any concern about nuclear weapons.
So, and you're working the International Atomic Energy Agency. I mean, you were a board member, I think, for a number of years. And at one stage, you were nominated for presidency.
Yes.
And yeah, a little bit about that, because that was a stiff contest.
Now, you see, the International Atomic Energy Agency has got a board, which is of different countries are members. And that is a pro-Western board. It's not a board that will support the majority of the countries which are non-aligned. So it wouldn't be there. So on that board, South Africa had a membership because it was the most advanced on the continent of Africa in nuclear affairs before freedom. So South Africa had virtually a permanent seat from the Third World because of that advance. And when we were in that advance, we then said, no, South Africa must not be allowed to be here. And South Africa was excluded, and then Egypt took that role. And we were quite happy with Egypt playing that role. When we became free and joined the Atomic Energy Agency, they wanted us, of course, to be there. And Egypt withdrew, And South Africa took its place as the most advanced in nuclear technology. So we came on the board. And the government here, the presidents and President Mbeki later, said I should go regularly to the board meetings from here, not just use our diplomats from there, so that we get experience and they get direction from the new government. So I attended all the board meetings every 3 months in Geneva, back again, in Vienna, and back again. Later, the question arose that most of the developing countries had experts going to IAEA conferences for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and then they go back home. And I said, this is no good. What you need to do to transfer technology to them is to give them equipment so they can work on it. But they were not given any equipment at all. So this was part of the campaign and general campaign to try and make it more democratic and legitimate. And then they said people in the IAEA also felt that I should stand for the candidature of the IAEA. My opposition was a Japanese gentleman, and President Mbeki said we should do it. So they nominated me, the government nominated me to be the DG. But there was no possibility of getting that because the vote is already loaded in favor of the West. But to the surprise of everybody, including us, we blocked the Japanese candidate 3 times in 3 votes. They thought in the first vote he would get it. So I got quite a large number of support, and he needed to get a certain amount of votes. He couldn't get those votes, so he was blocked for 3 times. After that, we said, well, that is the end. He will have to have it. So after that, he was made the DG. And I was a candidate for it. But it was more an educational campaign to try and make sure that people raise the issues. Those issues are still valid globally. So the International Atomic Energy Agency is still loaded in favor of the Western countries, and they are not prepared to really give direct assistance to developing countries in nuclear technology. But they can use nuclear technology for agriculture, for electricity, for a whole lot of things, but they don't have the expertise or the resources to do that.
Just, the topical issue is the current, ongoing dispute between Iran and the West on the issue of nuclear armaments and the position of the International Atomic Agency. What role did you play in that process for the time that you were in your official capacity?
When I was there, Iran was doing everything according to the regulations of the IAEA. So Iran was a member of the International Atomic Energy Agency and was working to all its declared positions. But politically, the Western countries didn't want Iran to advance. So they had put the worst motivations on Iran. But all the evidence was that Iran was not doing that. It was not breaking any laws. It was not doing anything wrong. So there was a very strong battle. And our government successfully took the position that we must protect the integrity of the IAEA. And that means every member of the IAEA. Not that we were pro-Iran or against Iran, is that we would protect the integrity of the IAEA. And if they broke IAEA rules, anybody then would act on them, but not before that. So at that time, Iran had not broken any rules, had not gone against anything. The IAEA inspectors were going there. In fact, Iran was one of the first countries, and we also did it in South Africa, where your uranium, if it is enriched and kept there, we would have permanent cameras watching it. So wherever you were at the IAEA, you could at their headquarters watch what was going on. So nobody would steal and take away from there. And in any case, inspectors would go there regularly to inspect the quantity of the uranium and so on. So at that time, we played an important role in trying to bridge the difference. But at that time, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that the Western countries didn't want a solution. Because Iran was a political target anyway. So they didn't want to settle. But we managed to persuade Iran to do many things, which it was not required to do, but it did out of generosity towards the IAEA and international agreement. Presently, I don't know what the situation is because I'm not part of the government and I don't have the documents and any information. But at that time, that was so. So I did play a role in that negotiation between the Western countries.
For the time that you were the secretary of the British Anti-Apartheid movement, you were not a member of the ANC.
No.
Can you explain that to us? Because there might be quite a few ANC people here, and it might come as a shock to them.
No,
Why was it? Was this just that you didn't want to become a member of the ANC, or was there some strategic or tactical reason behind that?
no. In South Africa, I grew up as if I was a member of the Congress movement. There was no membership form I signed or anything, but everything I did was reflecting that. But when I got into the anti-apartheid movement, or when Tambo said I should be the honorary secretary, he said, "You are responsible to the British people, and they will elect you. And you must not make the anti-apartheid movement an extension of the ANC." So I was a schoolboy. And I went home and I thought, good God, I've been thrown out of the ANC now. Terrible, I couldn't sleep because of that experience. But later, you see the wisdom of that decision. Because as a non-committed person, but just for anti-apartheid movement, the United Nations chairman of the Special Committee on Apartheid and others, they traveled all over the world. They always took me. They were meeting other governments. In that role, if I had been active in the ANC or member of the ANC, I could not have gone. The ANC would have objected, others would have objected, and so on. So I became known as the anti-apartheid movement, and I used that instruction I was given in 1960-61 fully credibly. So we worked with everybody as far as we could do that. And that is how African, Asian countries supported us, Caribbean, and had confidence in us, that we could not at any point betray them or anyone else. So I think that was a very good principle at the beginning, but Oliver Tambo had this great foresight to say, this is how we should work. And it was like a permanent foresight. People wouldn't have had that at the time, but he did. And that is how I had to work, and I worked with those instructions I was given earlier.
Just in the UK, I mean, which other prominent ANC leaders or party leaders, Communist Party leaders that you worked with at a high level, other than Tambo? Of course, Tambo is a given. But other names that come to mind?
Well, one is, of course, the famous Dr. Dadu. They were part of the United Front, as they called it, which was the ANC-PAC, Indian Congress Colored People's Organization. And you see, there was an issue that arose. When I was to be made Secretary of the Anti-Apartheid Movement, our question arose, if I use my name, the South African government would know and I couldn't return. Or if I returned, there would be a lot of risk involved. So I was talking to Yusuf Dadu one day, and he said, what should we do? He says, you are now Abdul Samad Minty, so Abdul S. Minty. Let's just use your name as Mr. Abdul S. Abdul. So he put the Samad at the beginning, and I said, but we had to make a decision for that evening. So that evening I became the secretary. So I was known as S. Abdul. What S stood for, nobody knew. And it was there. And it was caused a lot of problems in the first few years, because when I used to go to the House of Commons, the procedure is you send a little card to see a member of Parliament, and you put your name in the other one. So I would always put Abdul only, because, or S. Abdul. And the member of Parliament's name, you know. So when the member of Parliament is able to come out, the policeman there would read out the name, you know, that Jeremy Thorpe is here, or David Steele, or whoever. And then it called my name, and it says Lord Abdul. Lord Abdul. But because Lords only use one name, so there were incidents like that. Later on, of course, we use my full name. And
some of the other names beyond Dadu and Tambo?
Well, Dadu and Tambo among the South African leaders, but there were others. Robert Hesha, who was a staunch ANC supporter from November early, felt very upset with the people here who were arrested, like Nelson Mandela and so on. He would sometimes call me at 2, 3 in the morning. And, you know, we had no cell phone, we would call and say, we must meet in 2 hours. I have an all-night bus from Clapham, where I used to stay, to go to London. And he would have to come a long way. I said, why? But why must we meet? He said, because I can't sleep. So to go at night, middle of the night, meet him, And he would then talk for an hour, 2 hours more about what we could do about the political prisoners and how we could save the lives of some of them and what we should do. He was absolutely tortured by the fact that he was outside and there were people inside the country, his colleagues, who were in prison. But there were many leaders like that. There was Tennyson Makewani, who used to work with us in the beginning. He was the ANC's representative on the Anti-Apartheid Committee. He worked with that. Red September from the so-called Coloured People's Congress. He was also working there actively with it. He was very, very effective. And people came later too. I'm talking the early years that these people were there. But the later years, they knew some of the leaders that we were working with. Because Barbara Castle had been to South Africa. And when she visited South Africa before, she was told, don't go and stay in African area, I'm staying only in Africa. So she went to stay in some location and came back again and became prisoner from Anti-Apartheid later.
Just your experiences in the department when you joined. Obviously there were many old order diplomats there, functionaries, with many years of experience, schooled in a particular way. And how did you manage relationships? Were there tensions? Because it's almost like we've forgotten those difficult years of the transition.
Yes, those are the full story. I don't think anyone has told. The problem was that I was in South Africa. The original intention of the frontline states and everybody was that after South Africa becomes free, I would be in charge of a Southern African security arrangement, whereby all the countries would work together, so that South Africa, which is the most powerful, wouldn't threaten the others, and everybody would work equally. But at the inauguration of President Mandela, Julius Nyerere and others came up to me and they said, no, we'll change that mind. We think you should be in South Africa. You will contribute more to us and everyone else if you were in South Africa and we work for this thing. So the policy changed all of a sudden. That's what you When I first came, Alfred Nzo was the foreign minister, and I was appointed to be the Deputy Director General in Foreign Affairs. And but the head of the Foreign Ministry was Rusty Evans. Now, I had monitored Rusty for about 15 years before, and he was, in the last period, head of the Africa section of the Foreign Ministry. So he organized all the coups and everything that had to happen. All the dirty work in Africa was under him. And I knew it, because I monitored it all the time, read everything he said and so on. So when I first came to the government guest house in Pretoria, and came there, he came up to me, so he says, oh, you know, you should be our ambassador in Vienna, you did so much work in nuclear things and so on, and so on. So I didn't know what he was talking about. I said, well, why should I be ambassador there? No, you have done work on nuclear things, you're the expert there and so on. You haven't got much money, he seemed to know my private condition, and you'll be paid a lot of money if you become ambassador, you learn a lot. Very strange. Then there was a reception in the guest house, and his wife was there too. She also came round to me, both of them, one about this. So I went to Minister Nzo. I said, I don't know what's going on. You asked me to come here and do this multilateral work. They say I was going to do that. Who are they? Send them to me. Minister Nzo was very angry. How dare they tell you what to do? You just do what we say and so on. So I went, I told him, sorry, I can't do anything that anyone else tells me. So he wanted me out of the way, because I knew more about this old foreign ministry than many people around. Because we had monitored their attacks on African countries, what they were doing all the time, for decades. So I think because of that, they didn't want me around at all. In some meetings too, they were difficult. I don't know if this has any basis. No one, I haven't told anyone so far about it. But as soon as South Africa became free, we went to the first Commonwealth Conference in New Zealand. And President Mandela consulted me for many weeks before, and I went. And there was a problem with Nigeria because of the leaders there being executed and so on. So President Mandela took a strong position on it, so I went with him to New Zealand and so on. And then the next Commonwealth Conference was in the UK. And for some reason I was removed from it. Later I got a message from the President, why aren't you here? I need you for this, that and the other. I said, okay, they removed me from the delegation and I will send you the material from here. I went to see one of the ministers, got the additional information to make sure it's correct and sent it to him. So there were various efforts to isolate me or create difficulties and so on, but I was aware of it. But these continued. And I never had full confidence in that because all the intelligence services, all the government structures and so on remained as before. And they did not make certain to me any change. So we had to work against very heavy odds. And when we had to prepare documents for frontline states or African meetings and so on, it was always tough and we had to make sure we wrote it absolutely everything. And I think they used some of the new members of the government as well in that same way against us. So it created some tensions across. But I couldn't give up what I was doing all the years. So
just before we open up for a few comments or questions from the floor, as an ambassador, what were you doing in Geneva?
Well, the two things about the ambassador, you see, I'm the only South African with a democratic government who was made an ambassador without being an ambassador at a mission. It's because I worked a lot in foreign affairs and had experience, and when you work there, seniority of people depended on ambassadors. I wasn't preoccupied with it, but the minister and the president at the time said, no, you must become an ambassador. So I was made an ambassador before I had a diplomatic post. And then that remained till the end. But when I was sent there to Vienna and to Geneva later, I spent a longer time in Geneva. Vienna I went to because I was a candidate for the IAEA. That's why I was there for a year to help in the lobby. So I was ambassador to Geneva, that's where I've been for a long period. And that was a very interesting experience because we had to work with African, Asian, Caribbean and other countries. And they all cooperated with us. Some of them knew about me from before, of course, and some I met for the first time. But they were all extremely kind and extremely generous to us when we were
Let me just probe you on one more thing. How do you feel about the political situation in the country today?
I think most people are depressed, are disappointed. It looks as if not only in South Africa but also globally that when people attain power, they think it is for their personal financial benefit, not for any cause, for anything that they worked on. We were brought up on, the old leaders of the movement and the principles they held and how they worked, so that became part of our ethics. We had to work that way, and there was nothing questionable about it. But later on it looks as if people were, and it was very sad because at the very beginning, when I went to international conferences or diplomatic conferences, when you walked in somewhere and they said, South African representative, your prestige went up. People respected you a lot. People asked you questions. You responded to that responsibly, not in an opportunistic way. And then later, it went away. So towards the end, when I was, I was past the retirement age and I was still serving as ambassador. And some asked me to remain because of my experience and to remain with the government and so on. But morally, I couldn't. So I felt that after that last post, I didn't want any government connection because it was not something that I could defend anymore or feel proud of anymore. And it's a very sad development. I hope the young people will do something to change that, and that there are very, very bright young people, and that we will get back to some of the old values that we stood for.
Good. So I think we've exceeded our time. I said 1 hour. It's now 1.5 hours already. But I didn't hear any shuffling, so I take it that you were absorbed. You were interested. Don't give a speech. Quick comments or question. Short, because we've got maybe another 15, 20 minutes, or 30 minutes at most. But I think we would invite some amount of audience participation and engagement with Adbul Minty. Who's going first? Dr. Teo? You got a question or you just shuffling?
It's just a question, yeah.
Yes.
With regard to the anti-apartheid movement, for example, in Britain, how much did the British government or any other governments in the Western countries support these movements financially, politically, training you for the political events for the time of freedom? I don't know how much influence did they have on and was there any sort of indoctrination?
Well, in Britain, we were mainly supported by the leadership of the Liberal Party and the Labour Party, not by the Conservative Party. But there were individual Conservatives who supported us, as I said. They didn't give us any formal training in any way or whatever, but the fact that we could work with them with integrity and with trust, and we could tell them where we disagreed. I mean, when Labour got into power, just before that, before the election in March, there was a big event, and Harold Wilson was approached by Barbara Castle, and Wilson agreed to speak at our rally. So that was very important for us, to try and get a leader of a political party. When they got into power, the problem was that Barbara Castle was made a minister, the first minister for overseas development, because of her support for third world countries. So she was lost to us in that political sense. But there were a few times when we had rumors and reports from other members of parliament or some civil servants who we got to know over the years that Britain was reconsidering the arms embargo, for example, against South Africa. And then I would go immediately to the House of Commons and see Barbara Castle. She would see me, she never refused to see me, and tell her, I hear this is what's happening. She was an extremely active person. She wouldn't leave till the next hour anything that had to be done. So she would go and call straight into Harold Wilson's office. So you can relax the arms embargo against South Africa, we're against it. So there were spontaneous actions like that, many like that, that individuals took. But there were also others in the Labour Party with whom we had worked, who after they got into power began to compromise with us. So that was also an experience for people who had been there for a longer period than people like Barbara Castle who had been there for a shorter period. So nobody indoctrinated us in any way. I don't think we were that kind of material to be used. They could have tried, but I am not aware of them doing anything of the kind. And we were certainly not working that we have to run the country, so we better learn from them. No. We just worked with them with integrity and as much as possible with our own intuition. Intuition was very important in our work. When somebody came with the false things about South Africa is going to buy these arms or these arms to try and expose us, we had before worked through our intuition as to what it is that South Africa will need. We didn't have actual information, but just studying what they were doing and how they were doing it and the resources they had. So we would act on that basis. And nobody really was compromised with it, I know.
You referenced the Commonwealth meeting and the time when Ken Saro-Wiwa was facing the death penalty, and obviously President Mandela had taken that stance opposing the executions of him and several other Ngoni leaders. That's often held up as a kind of key moment in our sort of foreign policy, the history of our foreign policy in democratic South Africa, where we had attempted a policy very much informed by human rights, that there had been some blowback for South Africa, and that we had then sort of recalibrated or revisited. And I just wondered if you could give a little bit more detail or insight into that time and the discussions that happened at that time as to how we would then sort of move our foreign policy going forward.
Well, that was a difficult period because there were even members in the South African delegation that said, let's expel Nigeria. They didn't know that you cannot expel anybody from the Congo. So they didn't have the information. When we had to tell them, we were also unpopular. Because you can't say these things to them because we want to expel them. We said you could accept. But the problem is that Britain was the one country that wouldn't stand against Nigeria. Whatever Nigeria did, Britain would protect it. So we had a lot of tensions over a period of human rights issues. We were taking things up, and those countries were saying no, but Britain would support them. Why? Because Britain had a lot of investments in Nigeria. And Britain had always worked with Nigeria. Nigerians had worked with them. So we were not fully aware of it. I was a bit aware because of exile, but it's not fully aware. So that was part of the problem. So that Britain would not support us. Even then, we were on a small committee of the Commonwealth. I think it was a group of 8 countries. And there to propose something, Britain would oppose it. So Britain always acted to block action against Nigeria before Nigeria acted on it. So we had tensions between us and Nigeria because of that. But Britain played a terrible role throughout that. It really didn't play on any principle. It was just for its money, I think, that it acted in that way.
But just as a follow-up question, I mean, have we diluted our commitment to human rights issues globally because of that incident? Is that the marker?
I don't know. You see, because issues like that are very controversial. You could still be fully committed to human rights and not want to take action because you don't want to destroy the Commonwealth. So who's going to decide what was an issue for you at the time? People outside can make all kinds of judgments, but if you're inside, you had to do that. So I'm not sure that it became a problem. For South African President Mandela in particular, it became a human rights issue around that. And he campaigned on it and talked to people about it. But also some people he talked to misled him. Because of his authority, you just have to be with him to know his authority. And they wouldn't say no to him, but afterwards they would work against it. And you can't tell because they joint meetings, you see, and you don't know why they've done that. So it's a very difficult situation to advance that. But South Africa, having come out of its own history and took this position, when the Commonwealth leaders are there, they go on a retreat for 2 days or something. And the president can take one person. And so the Commonwealth Secretary General explained to us, you either take somebody to carry your bag or somebody to give you advice. So I was taken by President Mandela. So it meant that
to carry his bag.
it meant that on the plane, when we go from the normal conference to the retreat, that's where all the leaders are together. So you get a plane load of just Commonwealth leaders. And we were there and the president sitting at front. So I had to run up and down with messages to try and get different people to support what we were doing. But there were people who misinformed us. Even at that time, we were new, the first Commonwealth meeting. But they still tried to misinform us. But I knew a little bit about it because I'd been to other conferences. And so we were able to steer things through. So we had to have meetings every morning at breakfast time to clear everything, report everything, and to make sure that we worked as well as we could.
Thanks, Ismail, and thanks, Adbul, for that. Did you work closely with Lord Peter Hain while you were in the anti-apartheid movement? And more recently, Peter Hain has become vocal again, given the state of corruption in South Africa. Last week, I was privy to watching a parliamentary debate in the UK, where he's pushing for support from the British government on the formation on the adoption of an international anti-corruption court. Do you believe that the time has come, and many of senior leaders from various sectors are saying that corruption has now become the tipping point that we had just before the UDF then, that led to the change, the transition to democracy, and whether now the time is to get rid of corruption? And I won't say our democratic government, but I will say corruption, the extent it is and what is going on. Your opinions.
Oh, definitely. But Peter Hain, I knew his parents when they came to England. And he was a young boy at the time. And they are from the former Liberal Party in South Africa. So the people they knew and so on were from there, not from the Congress movement at all in the background. That's nothing against them, that's just an explanation of the situation. So Peter Hain grew up like that. He was a young Liberal at the time. Very strongly against Labour and so on, then became Labour, then became a Labour MP, then became Minister. you know, people change right across, and the ones that disagree with. So I've known Peter Hain since then he was a student working with the anti-apartheid movement, the Stop the 70s tour and all that. He has become more recently active, and that is a very good thing. So he's raised a number of things. Corruption is a very difficult global issue because you have to prove it and you have to show against whom it happened. But the problem is that so many people are involved in it that you don't get enough evidence to show it. Because they are also involved. The ones who can tell you are themselves involved in it. But corruption is a global problem. It's really a very, very big problem. That wherever you have political leaders, they seem to be using the political power for personal enrichment. It didn't used to be like that before. And therefore, the atmosphere has changed, the criteria has changed. People also make more concessions, more compromises. So, in the early stages, if you had some of this, people turned a blind eye because they knew them. Then it became in a habit and a way of life. And then those who were doing it expanded the area. So the first time anything happens, if you don't stop it, it's going to become a pandemic all of a sudden. And everybody is working with it. He's doing good work now. It's a pity he hasn't got very much more support in the British House of Commons. The people there don't seem to be interested. But if you look at Britain in other ways, it's a disgrace that they will not tax the oil companies. We're making 50 billion. I don't know how long it would take us to count 20 billion pounds, but it would take a very long time to count them if you had individual. But they don't want to tax them, and ordinary people are suffering with having to pay huge amounts of money for increases in price of oil and so on. There are people in Britain waiting now to go to the hospital for 3 years on waiting lists. Broken legs, everything can't go. So it's not this rosy picture that often is painted in the press and the media. It's a very difficult one, and I have friends there, of course. So it's global, this process of corruption and people misusing their positions for their personal benefit rather than working for the community. That doesn't mean we should do it. That doesn't mean we should.
I just want to add one more question, Ismail, to that. And I'll tell you why it's relevant. You know, you were talking with such passion prior to our democracy in terms of the fight for freedom and liberation. And now when you hear people in Zimbabwe saying life was better with the Rhodesian government, now when you hear people in South Africa saying life was better during the apartheid times, it really makes us wonder, where did we go wrong and how do we fix this, you know?
Well, that's one way to look at it. The other question is that true? It's not true. Even if they say life was better, it's not true. The majority of South Africans were oppressed. How could it ever be true? Whatever else they did. Unless they didn't care for their dignity. And there are, if they didn't care for that, then fine. They can say, they can measure it by other standards, you know. So they can continue doing that. A lot of white South Africans could say it with confidence because they lived in that life and they can now in this life, feel the pressure of it. So, but for black population, there's no question. How can they ever be, feeling that it is the same? It is very bad economically. Economically, it may be worse than before. That I'm not disputing. That may be so for some people. But I don't think that politically and generally in human terms, you can say that things were better then than it was. People see buildings, this is so old, how terrible, they were far better before. Of course they were far better. They had to deal with a minority. Now it's a majority. And it's a very big difference. I mean, we know it here because we had to give our water, our resources and so on to everybody, electricity free to people so that they could have at least some light. And so we have had pressures on our demands which we never expected before and nobody planned for it. They didn't plan before for the takeover. It happened after the takeover and many mistakes were made too. I'm not saying everything was fine. Many mistakes were made too. But you can't say that it was better before. No. Anybody who says that, they don't value their human dignity.
Iqbal, Shan, Afiza, you're doing some studies on the Congress School. You've got a question. Catherine, no question. Who else to say? Yeah, then we can wrap up. Iqbal.
I want to talk about Zimbabwe. I think the South African government and the South African people haven't really acknowledged the great sacrifice Zimbabwe made. I remember you saying one day that Mugabe actually delayed the independence of Zimbabwe just to accommodate white fears in South Africa. And can you just comment on how the British double deal with Zimbabwe and sold out in terms of the Lancaster Agreement? Because I believe they promised the Zimbabweans one thing and they didn't keep their promise, and that's why South Africa ended up with this big immigration problem from Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and even more than that. You see, what happened at the Lancaster House talks, and what we did in the anti-apartheid movement is we always arrange a briefing with the Truth Liberation Movement, ZAPO and ZANU, different days. And members of parliament were invited to this briefing so they could ask questions and interact with them. And in those meetings, it became clear that the British were playing various tricks in the British government. So the MPs were informed about it at these meetings, and so they took it up sometimes with their own parties and so on. But it was a very difficult process because Lord Carrington, who chaired the meeting of the Zimbabweans for the constitutional talks, he, would listen to everything, and at the end of the day, he would give them ultimatums. Tomorrow we'll discuss this. How do you know? Then it transpired that when they were all put in the same hotel, Marble Arch Hotel, they were all put in the same hotel, their telephones were tapped continuously. So they knew what they were talking to each other about. And on that basis, they gave them ultimatums. Next day, in the constitutional talks, and really messed up those talks quite substantially. But the liberation leaders were still quite astute and managed to ask for different things. Now at that time, the independence of Zimbabwe was worked at the constitutional talks, and later for the freedom of Zimbabwe. And Mugabe said no, he will not have the independence as early as they had planned before, because in South Africa it was very important to keep the confidence of the whites and not to frighten them. And if you kept their confidence, you could change South Africa also more easily than if you just gave it Zimbabwe independence and black people took over there and so on, and they acted like that. So he made, in fact, he was at that time considered to be one of the wisest leaders on the continent, with Nyerere. That were really considered to be the absolute wisest of the lot. So Mugabe has a long history, and even if you look now at Zimbabwe, no matter how much people don't like it, he spent a lot of resources on education in Zimbabwe. And look at the benefit of the Zimbabweans. Look at Zimbabweans or South Africans, they are far better educated. So they spent a lot of resources on education for their own people, for development. And later, of course, Mugabe went all wrong in a way and people lost confidence in him and so on. But at that time, he played a leading role in trying to do that. I mean, I can tell you personally, he invited me to the Zimbabwean independence celebrations. So I went to Zimbabwe, to Salisbury as it was before, for the celebrations. And we had to shake hands with people before we shook hands with the president. And one of them was General Walls. And General Walls had executed a lot of Africans. Not one or two, many, just sentenced them to death. I had great difficulty, so I refused to shake hands with him. And a couple of us went wrong, didn't go fasting and so on. And there was Mugabe. So for Mugabe at independence to deal with that government, and he had to have them in because he had to keep unity in the country. And people sometimes forget the kind of price that they had to pay at that time and what they had to do. So they don't get credit for the good things they did. They get attacked all the time for the bad things they do. But I think that we should get some balance in this. And therefore, Zimbabwe really, was promised a lot more money by the British to overcome the changes, and they never gave them money. Zimbabwe didn't have enough money to try and make Africans advance quickly after independence.
You got a question?
I do.
I didn't want to ask my question because everyone else's questions are so sophisticated.
No, ask your question.
So I'm doing research on the Comrade School, and you did mention that pupils were kind of a part of the organization of the school. So I'm very interested to hear a bit more about that. And then I also want to know a bit about how important like a school and the schooling environment is to the broader community. So what, how did that youth activism in the school influence the broader community?
What was the first part? I didn't get you.
The organization of the school and how you spoke
How you
about
organize the school.
Yeah. And pupils' involvement in the organization.
Well, Uncle Kathy and people were responsible for running the school, administering the school. And they made sure if any parents had any issues or whatever, that they would talk to them and try and work that out. But we were, in many ways, a totally revolutionary school, because we came from the rigid apartheid structure schools to this school where we were told we were in charge of our own discipline, our own rules and all that, so we had to make them. But we started the school without a single book in a library. A small library, about that poster-is about that. It was a collection in the library. And my grandfather gave me all the money for it. So we bought all the books for that, on art and all kinds of things. So when the pupils took books away, I would say to them, I want it back tomorrow morning, and they would read it at night, much of the night. That was a thirst for education. So they would, give it back, and then we would circulate it. So it was a school that was, now it influenced people a great deal, because remember, all the pupils were Indian. And for many of them who didn't have African friends before, I was lucky with a Congress office being around the corner from where I lived. For them it was a total revolution to be taught by Africans who were far better teachers than any whites they'd ever had before. So it was not just good teachers, but far better teachers. Dumanokwe was one of our teachers. While he was teaching us, he was at the same time doing his law at Wits University. And he got an excellent degree there. And he was also the Secretary General of the ANC. What more would one person be able to do? And he was able to do all that. So we had really remarkable people. And therefore, and we had no color. People of different colors were teachers, principal, headmaster and others. So it was a very remarkable school in that way, and I think it had an effect on the bigger Indian population, because they had never had their children go to schools like that, where they were having this kind of attention. So it made, I think, a big impact on the community, much bigger than the number of people who were there, because their parents had experienced this system.
Good. Faisal?
Now, if you allow me, two questions, please. Until you've talked a lot about the anti-apartheid movement, many people have commented that perhaps we have not done enough to recognize the importance role that the anti-apartheid movement played in bringing us to 1990 and what has happened subsequently. In your own view, do you think we've done enough as a country to give recognition to either to the organizations in the various parts of the world that formed the anti-apartheid movement and to the individuals? Of course, we know that we have a national order called the Order of O.R. Tambo that gives recognition to individuals from other countries, but is that enough? That's the one question. The second one is just taking us to what's happening presently in our country. Your own experience in foreign affairs on this matter of what's going on with the Americans, the ship that supposedly docked at Simonstown, and what has subsequently come out with the ambassador making the comments that he has made. Your views on that?
Well, first of all,
The man is retired now.
the question about credit for the anti-apartheid movement. You see, the lucky thing is that nobody in the anti-apartheid movement worked in order to get credit.
Sure.
So that's why you don't hear protests or anything. So if people want to give credit, that would be the decent thing to do. But most human beings do most of the things indecently. So don't do much decency. So I don't think you can expect, too much from that. But as I said earlier, our saving grace was that we relied on individuals, each individual, rather than any powerhouse. And we didn't concentrate on trying to raise large sums of money. There are other freedom movements today in other parts of the world where they try and amass millions, and they get it from other countries who sponsor them. And the struggle suffers. Because when people told us about money, we said if we don't do our work properly, people won't give us money. If our leaflets, our badges, our meetings are relevant, then people will respond to us. If they're not relevant, they won't. So if we go out of business, that's why we go out of business. So I think that's a very good lesson to learn. That the people you want to support from, the ordinary people, they will give their small pennies that they have, because it's not people, millionaires who give us money, small amounts of money. They'll give it if they believe what you're doing is worth it, because for them it's also a sacrifice to give that money. So you have to persuade them. How do you persuade them? With your actions and your integrity. So you must have integrity before you can go for that. So I think that if there is no, I don't think many anti-apartheid people have been given awards even in the national awards of the country. They haven't. It's become too much of a popular kind of issue over the years, unfortunately. And I don't know who's today responsible for all that and how to frame that. But the anti-apartheid movement hasn't. Globally, you look at it, they don't appear in the national awards at all. Others appear as individuals. So if you glorify individuals and want prominent personalities, fine, that you can do. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. But it's at the cost of the movements not getting the credit for what they've done. About the present situation, I used to be responsible for the arms control, the structures that we have. There is no way that they would have got the process of all the documentation and so on for this action. No way they would have got it together, unless they got a lot of people corrupt and giving false documents. And if somebody went there without permission and without the authority that they should have from the structures, then they could have done it. So I do not know what it means for this ambassador to later say he shouldn't have said this, whether he's talking about the fact that he didn't keep to protocol, or whether he's talking about the facts before it. So now that there is a government inquiry, let's wait for it and see what comes out. Were there any documents, or did the ship go and take consignments without any documents, in which case they acted illegally? So how did this happen? Who facilitated this or arranged this? But at the moment there is no evidence of there being anything like that happening. It's just now. I mean, this thing over the last 24 hours is shocking. If I was a US government, I wouldn't keep an ambassador like that, because that's not doing any credibility. That does a lot of harm to the country. But don't forget, it's not long ago that they said we were under a terrorist threat. South Africa was under terror. People shouldn't go to South Africa. Oh, big fuss about it. Government had to spend a lot of money on safety things, on all kinds of things. More police, more inspectors and all that to be put in place. It didn't happen. We're not saying it should have happened, but it didn't happen. It was their warning. So, if you are big, you can lie as much as you want, and you get away with it. Nobody calls you a liar. But if you're small and try and do it, then you get in trouble, because people punish you in different ways. It's one of the lessons that we should actually have learned and try to reverse.
But we might want to follow up on Barbara Carson for a national award. I don't know we'll have to just check the facts, but I mean that clearly is a person that's worthy of a nomination. She's passed away, it could be a posthumous thing, but I'm just saying we might look at some names as part of the future process. Time is running out. Catherine and then Shan, the last one. Right.
Thank you. I find it extremely painful, and I have heard it before, the point you make about the neighbouring states being as hurt, you said even more hurt than our own people. And I wonder whether you could say what could or should be done, whether, you know, within government structures, within whatever, to correct that. I mean, I know there's some, you know, economic attempts and so on, but I just think who should be taking responsibility for correcting that? Because the damage continues, obviously.
No, you see, the pain I'm talking about are the bombing
Yeah.
of actual villages,
Yeah.
or even in cities. South Africa just bombed, didn't care. Nobody got justice after that from that, because they were the more powerful, and so they could do it. But if you go to Mozambique, or Tanzania, or Zambia, or any of you see it. You see it. The people are buried there, including South Africans who are running their own refugee centers. You know? Yeah. So how do you put a price on that? And you can't do something now for it. So what we have done is to say that they can come and stay in South Africa. We've been more liberal towards the frontline states because of this history. They have paid a higher price, and often higher price than us. We were not citizens. You know, here there were no villages or locations that were mass bombed. Didn't happen. Others were killed. I'm not saying, you're not justifying one thing for the other. But they suffered without doing anything themselves, except supporting the South African struggle, which is a big human cost. So God will see that and balance it, but human beings are not able to do that properly. So the neighboring countries, they were poor already. They were in poverty already. And then to be in addition bombed and their crops poisoned. How do you live after that? In there, you don't get anything. So I think they paid a very big price, and they had remarkable leadership. But the leadership said we must continue to do that, we must continue to support people and so on, and they did. So they made huge sacrifices. That's why I have great admiration for them. And they did it, because I've seen some of the cost, not all, very little of the cost. Others have seen much more. But I don't think that we can do anything to repay it, except behave well ourselves. And you can't behave well if you don't put your own country right. So you have to do that, and then, expand the area. So there's a big responsibility on you. But I don't think many individuals feel that responsibility in this way that I'm speaking.
Sure.
There's two things. One, the working relationship between the anti-apartheid movement and the ANC, or the liberation organizations. Were there points where they felt overshadowed by the anti-apartheid movement? And if so, how were those kinds of tensions? How did they manifest? How were they handled? And then secondly, is somebody working on your story, your biography? Or is this part of the processes? Because I think it picks up on the point that Faisal is raising. That history, as much as you're saying people did it and that acknowledgement is not important. But as you know, unless history is told by those who make it, others are going to interpret it, and they might not interpret it in the way that you would like it to be.
Well, for the anti-apartheid movement from the beginning, we felt that we must have the liberation movements on the National Policy-Making Committee as observers, because they're not British organizations. So ZAPU, ZANU, ANC, PAC, South African Coloured People's Congress and the Indian Congress, they had office in London. So they were all put together, the South African United Front, 4 organizations. And then the neighboring countries were all there. And then we moved from there to, as we found the attacks taking place against them, to defend the frontline states. And I had the privilege of being invited to several frontline state meetings. I'm not the government, but they invited me to it. As an act of solidarity from them for what they were doing and what we had done for them. So we worked together. We had no competition with them. Whether they felt overshadowed by us or that, I do not know. But how could any liberation movement in Britain think that it could be stronger than the anti-apartheid movement? It could. It's a contradiction. The people who would support us would support them. So there was no competition. There was no separate liberation movement or ANC structure taking place and anti-apartheid taking place, and you have to watch it. Because we were working together, all of us. And our decisions as to whether we'd have a consumer boycott or whatever were all worked together at the National Committee, the which met once 3 months. So people could come there and give their views, and then we would take a decision. And we were in that way always democratic in terms of it. We had about 260 branches in the early years in Britain in the boycott movement, but later very many more. So we acted throughout the country like that. But I think it is a question of working with integrity and working for, if you wish, for the cause. It's a dirty word today because people misuse it. But that you're working for some ideal that you have. You are trying to live it even if you didn't succeed. It was worth the effort of doing it. There were no guarantee that you will succeed from it. So that was done. Whether a record should be done, I mean, it is important because a lot is lost already. And Ismail's been encouraging me a lot. That's why I'm even here. But a lot of the things that are written, you have to also balance what is written. Few things I've seen written is people, without being conscious of it, aggrandizing themselves rather than the issue. And that I reacted against. So that's why I didn't want to write anything or do anything, because I didn't like it. That wasn't the history I knew. So to try and live that history in a different way would have been damaging that process and that integrity. So you have to keep a sense of integrity. Also, when I say, I did this as this individual, but I did it with thousands of people. I mean, hundreds and thousands of people supported us when we stood up and said things. So today, if somebody says, this one did it, that we say, no, you're betraying the others. You can't do that. That we'll never allow. So those who are genuinely in the solidarity movement would never allow that. It will be a defeat of what they were doing. And why did they do it under more difficult conditions, and now under easy conditions do this? No, it's not worth it. So nobody would do it if they didn't have the honor of the people who had given much of their lives. When small little things like this young girl who wouldn't eat oranges, in a family which didn't eat meat either, they're a vegetarian family, living in England in winter, not to be able to eat an orange from South Africa, which is the only one that was exporting. It's quite a big sacrifice to think of people far away whom she had never met or even seen, but acted because of a belief in a value system. So it was only in terms of the solidarity of the principles that people acted. And that's why we had remarkable people around us, people with great quality. They were not important or unimportant, but they were remarkable people. So everybody did their little bit that they had to do. That is the history that needs to be recorded.
Now, in today's time, you don't come across many interviews that uplift you. So let me leave it at that. Thank you very much.